to help us navigate this topic and make ontologies feel a bit more approachable. We are joined by someone with extensive experience in the area. And I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, which is Danielle Welter. And this is a principal data scientist at the Luxembourg National Data Service. And this is also a member of ELIXIR Luxembourg. And today, Danielle will guide us through the world of ontologies, and she will try to clear up some common misconceptions or give us some practical tools inside and resources to use them effectively in our work. So without further delay, I will hand over to Danielle, and welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Yes, hi, I'm Danielle Welter, Luxembourg National Data Service and ELIXIR Luxembourg. My official job title is indeed Principal Data Scientist, but effectively I work in data management, metadata, semantic engineering, ontologies. I've been in and around ontologies for going on 20 years at this point. So I'm from various sides of it, and I just wanted to share a little bit about why ontologies are important and clear up a few indeed misconceptions and myths that they are very scary and so on. If you were at the ELIXIR All Hands meeting in Greece earlier this year, you might have seen a shorter version of this talk, but today I can expand on a few more things in a bit more detail. So let's see if this works. Yeah. So I have half an hour. I can't tell you everything I know about ontologies, but I wanted to clear up a few common misconceptions, and then I wanted to give you a bit of a toolbox, 4 different use cases on what you can do with ontologies, how you can use them, and so on. And I also wanted to show you one of my absolute favorite use cases that really showcases how ontologies are actually very cool and useful. So generally, we've heard about, if you work in data management and fair data, we've heard about ontologies. Yes, they're important, but really, what are they? They're too boring, or they're too hard, or they're too complex, and they become this mythical dragon that really we should go and fight, but we're just going to leave it on the side because we don't, yeah, it's just too scary. So very often I talk to people and they go like, well, yeah, okay, ontologies, but they're only useful for data annotation and they're so complicated. So why do we bother? Well, it's not technically wrong that ontologies are really important in data annotation. But you know, that's like saying, oh, well, wheels on a car. I mean, they're only wheels. Yes, but without it, the car wouldn't run. So why do we use ontologies? Well, we use them to reduce ambiguity. Ontologies help us define concepts, the links between them. We tend to work in very complex domains, so it's not just about saying this is a tree or this is a cup. They are very complex ideas that we have to share, and defining them means that if I talk about a concept and we have a shared definition, then we can be sure that we're actually talking about the same thing. We can capture the relationships between concepts in ontologies. And again, that's something I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. And it's also as basic as capturing cross-references between things and synonyms. So there are lots and lots of ontologies out there. And if you've used one and I've used another, rather than one of us having to go back and change all our work, if there are cross-references and cross-links between these concepts, we can still get from A to B without having to redo a bunch of work or remap everything, or just go, oh no, this is not possible. The other advantage of using ontologies is they are both human and machine readable. So in the era of big data, we need to rely on our computers to do a lot of work for us. So we need to give the computers the tools to understand the data that we give them, understand the texts we give them, and so on. But very often when we have computer readable stuff, code, and so on, it's not really very friendly for humans. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have our clinicians, we have our lab scientists who might not be that familiar with computers, and who still need to be able to give us that data and describe their data. So having that a tool that allows to do both humans and computers to use this is essential, because otherwise somebody gets left behind. And without ontologies, we wouldn't have the capabilities for data integration, for data sharing, and therefore for reproducing our experiments. So we'd end up over here in the Middle Ages, where the whole point is to not replicate our alchemy experiments. And it's more about telling a computer what all of these bits mean. So how do we use ontologies beyond just data annotation? We use them in smarter searching. I've already mentioned data integration, and I'll talk about this use case a little bit more later. Data analysis is probably the most well-known one. Go enrichment has been around for, again, almost as long as I've been in ontologies. So that's a really common use case in ontologies. Semantic modeling for knowledge expansion, and I'll show you an example of that in just a second. And then data visualization. This was one of the very first jobs I did out of my PhD on the GWAS catalog, and all this data visualization is driven by ontologies and by ontology annotations. So yes, it's still a lot of annotation, but actually without it, none of these things would happen. So specifically, the smarter searching, for example, if you think of classic searching, you type in a string and it's or a word, and the computer matches that word to other words. If you've made a typo, it doesn't find anything. Things that are spelled slightly differently or that have synonyms, it won't find. If you use ontologies under the hood and make the searching smarter, now you can suddenly consider the synonyms for your term. You can go up and down hierarchies, and you can look at parent terms, child terms, even sibling concepts, and just widen it. So if you're interested in metabolic disease, for example, there are lots of types of metabolic disease. If you're using an ontology, then that can bring all these subtypes in, and you get much richer results than if you're relying on that just specific term. And then again, I've already mentioned data integration. Text mining is another really big one. Mining literature to tag terms and build up a body of knowledge. And then knowledge discovery through revelation of hidden patterns in the data, and using these relationships for new knowledge. So that being said, a lot of times I hear people use ontologies, but they also use words like vocabularies or glossaries. And I mean, they're all the same, aren't they? Well, they're not quite. So this is, don't read too much into this graph, but as you go up this line, at the very bottom, you've got glossaries, and then you get more complex, and you go to controlled vocabularies, taxonomies, and to ontologies. And as you move up this, the technologies also get more machine readable. So glossaries generally tend to be PDFs or Word documents or something like that. And then you tend to get a bit more complex, maybe having CSV files or Excel spreadsheets, RDF, and then ontologies generally OWL modeling language. So as you go up, you would become more precise. It's what we call semantic precision. When you hear semantic, think ontologies, think knowledge modeling. On the other hand, time and money also go up. It's much easier to quickly bash a vocabulary into a Word document than it is to build an ontology. So there is a trade-off, and there is a place for both. But as we get to the top here, we have more connections beyond just parent-children. It goes out further beyond that. You become more expressive, and you're not tied to a specific implementation. You become a sort of abstract. You can model domains rather than being tied to a programming language, for example. So specifically, when we talk about glossaries, normally we mean something that is not machine readable. So a Word document or a PDF, something that is a flat list. You might have a label, you have definition if you're lucky. I have seen glossaries that include synonyms, but it is rare. Then getting a bit more complex, you can have vocabularies, or what we call controlled vocabularies. They're still usually flat. Again, you'll have terms, definitions, usually synonyms. They tend to be machine readable, at least at baseline. They might still only be a CSV file, but in order to be called a controlled vocabulary, really, you should have some level of machine actionability. And identifiers are not required, but usually they're still being used because it, again, improves that machine readability and interoperability. Then the next level beyond that is a taxonomy. You might have heard of the NCBI taxonomy for species, for example. So there you start to have a hierarchical structure. Taxonomies should always be machine readable. They must use identifiers, and they'll have strict parent-child relationships. So every time you have a child term, it means everything, that applies to parent, applies to the child. I wanted to very briefly highlight here a very famous vocabulary, not a taxonomy, called MESH, which is used very widely in the US. MESH sometimes gets called taxonomy. It is not. MESH has logical groupings of things. I double-checked it just this morning to be sure I was still saying the right thing. If you look at MESH in its hierarchy, you will see finger under hand. Now, if you think a finger is a hand, please see my 6-year-old for some medical education after this session. But so those are the basic categories that we have. And then we've got the ontologies, which are at the very top of that complexity. They add even more structure. So you're not just going up and down, but you're also having these connections to through other links, for example, has part. Quick health warning about this screenshot. It's quite an old one. Some of these connections no longer exist, but it's too much hassle to recreate a screen grab. I'll give you a proper example that still exists here. So this is, you don't need to take too much away here from this example in terms of the particularities. It's about cell lines. Don't worry if you don't know nothing about cell lines, but it's about showing what ontologies can do really concretely with an example. So we've got here a cell line called SC1. You don't need to know anything about it other than it's a human cell line derived from a lymphoma in a male. And what's important here is these facts that we stated about it. We stated it derives from a B cell and from a blood sample, and indeed that it is human. So these are all facts that we know about the cell line, and we stated them in this slightly peculiar format that is particular to ontologies. And then we have another bit of our ontology where we have something called a B cell derived cell line. And again, we have these sets of statements, and here we said equivalent to, which means in order for something to be cell derived cell line, it must fulfill these conditions. It must be derived from a B cell. It must be part of either a developmental stage or an organism part, and it must be part of a specific organism, which is another term for species in this context. Now, what's important to see here, there is no little chevron. So if you've got a little chevron like this next to a term, it means it has children. This term has no children. But now we look at these definitions next to each other. So in both cases here, we have our derives from, we have a B cell, we have this part of bit. Here it says blood for SC1, which is an organism part. You'll have to trust me on that one. And it's part of Homo sapiens, which is an organism. Again, you'll have to trust me on that one, but that is, both of those are true. Now we use a tool in ontologies called a reasoner, which is a rather complex black box piece of software that process an ontology step by step and looks at every possible connection and computes every possible link that you can use based on these fact statements that we have made when we built the ontology. And when we're done running the reasoner over this particular example, we suddenly see that SC1 now has a bunch of new facts over here. It's a B cell derived cell line. It's a Homo sapiens cell line. It's a lymphoma or leukemia cell line. I didn't include those, but you've got all of these things in yellow. If you see yellow here, it means new knowledge that we hadn't stated before. It's now inherited a bunch of things, such as the definition that we looked at a minute ago from B cell derived cell line. The other important bit to note is B cell derived cell line 4, no chevron. Now it's got a whole load of children, including our friend SC1. So this is a very particular example related to cell lines. You can do this sort of thing for any domain of knowledge. You can define patterns. You can state facts with these patterns that you know about a specific concept. And after reasoning, you can build this body of knowledge. Now, if you're looking at one single cell line, and at this example, you might go, well, duh. That was really obvious that SC1 is a B cell derived cell line based on all the facts that you stated. But if imagine doing this for 100 cell lines or 1,000 cell lines that you receive from different labs. When you build up this body of knowledge, suddenly asserting all of these things becomes really difficult. Or imagine you didn't initially know about lymphoma or leukemia cell lines because you didn't have that term. If you retroactively add that, reusing the facts that you stated when you were collecting all the individual cell lines, you can build the hierarchy of lymphoma or leukemia cell line after the fact without having to go back and add this additional fact to every cell line it applies to. So that is one of the really powerful aspects of ontologies. Having said all of that, you've probably gone, oh, well, yes, but that's the point. It's really complex. This looks really complicated. We don't understand these relationships. This is ridiculous. Ontologies are just for experts. Point proven. Yes, ontologies can be a little complicated. Some of the main complaints I often see is, why do ontologies mix user understand the main concepts with weird abstract things? Like if you look over here, you might see animal feeding, calibration. Yeah, I sort of understand these terms without any massive specialist knowledge. Data visualization and data transformation. Yeah, I know what those are. Disease. Yeah, I know what a disease is. But what on earth is a specifically dependent continuant? Now, I first came across that term in 2010, and it's now 15 years later. And every time I come across it, I have to go back and look up what it means, because I cannot for the life of me ever remember what a specifically dependent continuant is. So I'm an ontology expert and I still struggle with it. Don't worry about it. Another really common challenge that people find is that the same or similar terms appear in many ontologies. So just this one example here has quality listed 4 times, including rather badly from the same ontology. What are you supposed to do with that? Or if you search for type 2 diabetes, you get dozens and dozens of results from different ontologies. How do you pick? Well, let's address the first question first, this mix of weird and understandable terms. The whole point of ontology is we want to make them interoperable, but we don't want them to be huge. We don't want to build one single ontology to rule them all, because it would be huge, it would be unusable, unwieldy, and it wouldn't reason or anything. We want to keep them nice and self-contained in a domain. We in fact use the term domain ontologies, so that you might have an ontology that describes the domain of disease, or the domain of the environment, or the domain of animal behavior, any of these. But ultimately, when you use them, you want to make connections between them. So how do you go from one to the other? Well, here's what we use, something called upper level ontologies, which is a bit of an umbrella or a common framework to tie ontologies together. So the 2 most common ones in the biomedical space are BFO, the basic formal ontology, or COB, which is core ontology for biology or biomedical sciences. And I've got a bit of an example here from 2 ontologies, the environment ontology ENVO and the ontology for biomedical investigations OBI. Now, say you're doing a biomedical investigation, you're trying to annotate some stuff around sample collection, and you need to bring sample collection locations into it. So you've got your specimen collected in one encounter, for example, and you want to link it to treated wastewater because that was where you collected the sample. Well, luckily for you, first off, OBI already includes the specific ENVO term environmental material. Now you'll notice here, it doesn't have a chevron. In ENVO it does. There's lots of stuff under it. In fact, there's over 1,000 concepts under there. That's fine, but you've already got this one connection. And at the top here, you've got these very obscure terms of entity and continuant and independent continuant and material entity. We normally understand what to do with material entity, but the other ones are a bit, nah, don't worry about it. You don't need to know what they mean really, but what is important is that they are in both. So they give you the framework of where you hang things under it. And that's really all that, unless you're an ontology expert, what you need to use them for. But that is really, really critical. And that is why we have these bizarre terms at the top. I've mentioned the 2 most commonly found in the biomedical space. BFO is actually domain agnostic. It wasn't specifically developed for the biomedical space. It's used very widely in sciences, in general, in physics, in chemistry, and environmental sciences, and so on. And it's a very philosophical way of looking at it. I spent a little bit of time on BFO a few years ago, just because I'm a nerd, and I still don't understand what the continuant fiat boundary is supposed to be and what I'm supposed to do with it. So really, normally we focus on things like material entities, which includes sites, so immaterial material entities, and then we put other things under it, qualities and so on, and we don't particularly worry about the really philosophical concepts, which are quite obscure. There's an ontology community in the biomedical space that agreed with this assessment, and so they decided to simplify things a little bit and build the core ontology for biology and biomedicine. It reuses some of BFOs. You might recognize again the immaterial entity here, or the process material entity and so on. But it really asks, what do we need in the biomedical sciences? And we know we need a lot of anatomy, so we grabbed anatomical entity. We look at characteristics. We deal a lot with information content entities, which includes what we call data items, so data elements. So that's a really important part for it. We deal a lot of concrete things, material entities, which can be anything from chemicals to molecules to cell lines and so on. So that was an important one. And then we do model a lot of processes. You've got biological processes from go there, environmental processes, and so on. So they put together a slightly more pragmatic upper level that still helps bring together most biomedical ontologies. That's all you need to remember about this, that it's an umbrella framework. I mean, there's lots of brilliant tutorials if you wanted to know more details about it, but if all you take away is the weird abstract terms are really connecting terms, then I've done my job for today. So the other problem, there are so many ontologies to choose from. How do we know which right is right? There are, same concept in many ontologies. How do I pick? Well, in some ways, when we look at our world that we know, we think there's a single source of truth. That's not true in ontology world. Context is everything. So you think something, cardiomyopathy, it's a heart thing. It's a disease, right? Well, if you look at the monarch disease ontology, yes, it is. It is a disease. It's heart disease. It's muscle tissue disease. But maybe you're more in the physiology department, in which case you might want to look at the human phenotype ontology, where it's a phenotypic abnormality of the myocardium. Or maybe you don't work in humans at all. You work in mice. You might want to look at the mouth pathology ontology, where it's a pathological process. Or you work in drug development or other clinical findings where you care about adverse events, in which case you might want the ontology of adverse events, which also has cardiomyopathy. Or you work in rare disease. There are very rare forms of cardiomyopathy, which, again, context is everything. So that's something really important to bear in mind when you search for ontology terms. Don't just blindly pick the first term that matches. Look at the definitions. Look at the context around the term. Does this ontology actually match what you're trying to say and the domain that you work in? That's a fundamentally important factor when working with ontologies, when choosing ontologies. So a few common pitfalls. I've just described the improper reuse one. You use something in a context that it wasn't intended for. So if you're describing the disease that a patient had, from which a sample was taken, and you use the mouse pathology ontology, you're not capturing correctly the context because you're using a mouse applicable term in a human. So people tend to take that one very seriously when I tell them, and then go to the other side. I've got 99 terms that perfectly match, but this one doesn't, so, oh well, I need to build my own ontology. Please don't do that. There is reuse. There are middle grounds between point 1 and point 2. I'll give you some pointers on that as well. But don't just go and build a new ontology because no single ontology is a perfect match. Then the other side of that we often see in ontologies is scope creep. So usually when somebody goes and builds a new ontology, they will have a fairly defined area that they want to work in. And then sooner or later, people start requesting terms that don't fit into that space. And sooner or later, your ontology is a department store with lots of different things in it that don't really belong there. And then the last one is a little bit more technical, but it's not respecting constraints. So when you're recording your facts in ontology world, usually every type of relationship is restricted to linking specific types of contexts, or what we call a domain and a range. If you break that and you start linking things together that are not supposed to be linked together under this relationship, your reasoner gets very unhappy, or even if yours doesn't, reusing ones might get very unhappy. Again, there's lots of cool tutorials around this where you can test this knowledge, but just to give you a bit of a hint, that is another really common one. And you see it even in ontologies that have been published, and it just breaks things. So there's the question that I always try to tell people: don't just go and build an ontology. On the one hand, if you want to build ontologies, please do. Don't build an ontology because you couldn't find the one term that you needed. Ontologies are not carved in stone and just sit there and never to be touched again. They're supposed to be dynamic and well maintained. So if you're interested in ontology, request new terms. Most of them are on GitHub, certainly if they're in the Obo Foundry. You can interact with the developers as an ontology development. I love it when people come to me and say, I need this new term, because it means you're using it. If there are things that aren't a perfect match, please do go interact with ontologies, request new terms. Obviously, give some thought to what you're requesting. And referring back to my scope creep question, don't ask them if you have a human anatomy ontology, please don't ask them to add a plant anatomy term. It's not the place for it. But if there's a human anatomy term missing, do ask them about it. So I'm realizing I'm already quite well into my time, but I wanted to give you a bit of a toolbox. And this toolbox is aimed at different levels of users. So if you don't really know anything about ontologies and you're just getting started, you want a bit more information, here's some things you can look at, and you will get the presentation later so you can actually use all the links. So you've got the FAIR cookbook and the RDM kit, which if you're in the ELIXIR space and data management, you've hopefully heard of. There's also the ELIXIR RDM guidelines, again, which point at ontologies. And they have information in themselves, these resources, but they also link out to additional resources. There's a bunch of ontology training materials in tests. Again, another ELIXIR resource, so you can just search for ontologies and you get a whole load of information. Lots of it related to Go, so gene ontology, but also other ontologies. And then I also wanted to refer you to the Obo Foundry resources, in particular the Obo Academy OBOK, which is a bit more on the technical side of ontology development, but has some fantastic tutorials and other how-tos, and also links out to further courses. So they're all really great places to get information, help, training, and so on. Then for practically to work with ontologies, if you just want to find either ontologies or terms in ontologies, my go-to is always OLS. It was developed by the team at EBI that I used to be in. I've also worked on OLS. They are now on iteration 4, hence the 4 in the URL. And it contains a bunch of ontologies, and you can search across them. You get your results. You can click through. You can move between ontologies, and so on. On the American side, the equivalent to OLS is the Bioportal. I tend to prefer OLS, but there's not much to choose between them. And also being a US resource, Bioportal includes some ontologies that you can't get in OLS, such as Medra or Loink, for licensing reasons. In Bioportal, you can also upload your own ontology. So OLS tends to only load curated ontologies, whereas Bioportal, anybody can go and chuck their ontology into it, and then it's discoverable. For finding ontologies rather than browsing them, you've got the Obo Foundry of open biomedical ontologies. So they have a massive list where you can look at who maintains the ontology, where its homepage is, and so on. And it also takes you through to various browsers for looking at ontologies. More widely, for finding things that are not in the Obo Foundry, you've got FAIR sharing. This is also great for finding standards, connections between standards, and so on. This is a brilliant resource. It's a little bit impenetrable sometimes because you just search and you get back. It's like going to Amazon and getting standards back. But they have now got a brilliant assistant which helps you guide you through your searches a little bit more, and also gives you collections of 4 domains that have been curated. If you're specifically interested in 2 ontologies, namely Loink and the NCI thesaurus, you can get either of those on these specific links as well. They are optimized for these 2 ontologies, but you won't get anything else in there. Then the famous data annotation. If that is something you want to do, there are actually no perfect tools for data annotations because a lot of them are context specific. Depending on what domain you work in, you might have data annotation tooling dictated by what databases you submit to, or what databases your project uses, and so on. Or you might just do it in an Excel spreadsheet. But I did want to highlight 3 tools that are more general purpose, and they are open source. I mean, there's also literally hundreds of commercial tools that help with semantic integration, ontology maintenance, and so on. But in the academic space, we tend to prefer open source options. So ISA Tools has got a Google Sheets plugin called Automaton, which helps embed ontology terms in Google spreadsheets. It's quite well maintained. I've used it a few times. There's a bit of a barrier to setting it up, but once you've set it up, your users can use it quite nicely. On the US side, the same people as develop BioPortal also work with, or have also released something called the CEDA Workbench. So it's an online platform. You log into it, and then you can build metadata templates with ontology terms built into it, and then your users on your project can go and fill their metadata in and so on. I haven't used it widely, but I know some US projects that use it and rate it very, very highly. On the more European side, you then got Molgenis, which is a similar principle to CEDA, but there is, as far as I'm aware, no public instance where you can just go to. So if you wanted a Molgenis instance, you would need to host your own. But again, it's the same principle. You build metadata profiles where you can tie ontologies into, and then you can use this to collect data, to annotate data, and so on and so forth. If you're really keen on working with ontologies and actually getting your hands dirty with them, the most common ontology editor, also open source, is Protégé. There's a downloadable desktop version, and there's now also Web Protégé, which is a bit like a Google document or a Google spreadsheet for ontologies, where you can do collaborative editing. If you do want to go into building ontologies, you would do well to use the ontology development kit. It does a lot of the setup framework around, for example, using GitHub, about continuous integration, about doing release process, and so on. And I can't recommend it enough. We've migrated several ontologies recently to the ODK, and it makes your life so much easier. For mappings between ontologies, there is the simple standard for sharing ontology mappings, SOM. Again, it's a community maintained standard. It's got formats and so around it, and it's a really cool resource. And I also wanted to mention Robot. It gets forgotten a little bit often these days because it underlies a lot of the ODK. So Robot came first, and then the ODK got put over the top. But Robot is a library of functionalities for doing stuff with ontologies. And there are a few things that I don't like doing in the ODK because they're a bit too complex, so I tend to do them in Robot standalone. So I do periodically remember that it exists. And again, for comparing ontologies or building templates and so on, if you don't want a full ODK setup, a Robot as a command line tool still works really well. I just want to mention a couple of other resources around mappings. You've got the RDA Fair Mappings Working Group and the Fair Impact Work on Semantic Artifacts, which are always looking for people to muck in. If you want to find out a bit more, there's an introduction to biomedical ontologies by Barry Smith, the brain behind the basic formal ontology. It's an 8-lecture video series from the University of Buffalo. It's free, and you can just watch those, read the materials, and it is quite useful. And if you want to learn more about building ontologies, the pizza tutorial has been updated for Protégé 5 on that link. And if you're wondering why pizza, this was a very early lesson from the ontologies community on how you want to train people. In one of the early workshops, they got a bunch of clinicians together, and they wanted to get them to build an ontology. And the clinicians spent 3 days arguing about how to classify cardiovascular disease rather than building an ontology. So they went, right, we need something that is a bit more general purpose, that people are not going to argue about the nitty-gritty. So they went pizza. So the pizza tutorial uses the basics of pizza to help you build a very basic ontology and introduce ontology concepts. But it's really funky, and it's been updated for the latest version of Protégé. So it's a really cool thing to check out, because we all know something about pizza, or at least we all have opinions about pizza. So I'll very quickly run you through my favorite ontology use case in a nutshell. So I've hopefully convinced you that ontologies are useful. They are widely used. So if you're using any form of standard, such as the ELIXIR framework, Pheno packets, and so on, they have a placeholder already for ontologies. Some of them tend to mandate ontologies in specific places, like saying, for this concept, you must use this ontology. Others are a bit more lightweight about it and say, for this concept, you should use an ontology, but they don't tell you what to use. But that shows you sort of the embedding of ontologies. Now, why is this important? What can you do with it? My favorite example of this, the Open Targets platform. It's a pre-competitive partnership between a number of pharmaceutical companies and academic institutions. And it's been around for quite a few years, and it built into this platform that uses information from a number of openly available sources, such as drug repositories, the GWAS catalog is one of them, various other EBI deposition databases that already have data annotations. And then there's underlying data model, which is deceptively simple. It's more complex than what this now does. This is just an extract of it that says how various entities are related. So the core data model is drugs, drug targets, and diseases and phenotypes. And just using the facts that have been curated in these various public sources, it builds up this huge knowledge model that can then be used for finding new drug targets. So you might know that a specific drug acts on a specific protein and involves a specific compound, but the question is, does this interact from something else? So you might get additional knowledge around proteins and molecular interactions from other resources, and the question then is, can I use this drug for other things? And there's been some really great results coming out of that platform. There's a new paper actually then, the 2021 one. I've just added that one here because it had a nice image in it. And it is, to me, one of the most beautiful examples of leveraging ontology annotations from these different sources, where you're kind of going, well, why did you bother annotating these things? Because we already know what these things are, but putting them all together, pulling out this new knowledge is just such a powerful thing. And it really comes into evidence when you go to scale. Because if you look at your one example or your 10 examples, it's like, oh, was it worth the effort? But once you look at hundreds of thousands of facts, this body of knowledge and what you can draw from it is really, really powerful. And it also, again, feeds into the modern ecosystem around AI and so on. So again, their ontology annotations and good quality ontologies are crucial for building up this body of knowledge. There's some more examples in the FAIR cookbook around what cool stuff we can do with ontology. So we've built a clinical trials protocol for pediatric clinical trials, for example. There's a recipe on that. There's another one on COVID-19 samples or clinical cohort data sets for biosample deposition. And that's it from me for today. I hope you found this interesting and a little bit useful. And thank you for listening.